Okay, we'll just do a test. That one seems a bit better. And we'll get going again for the afternoon. So in your OneDrive, there's a document there called Guide to Attachments. We'll just go through that if you wanted to open it up, or we can look on screen here. So it's really the list that we've just, the checklist that we've just put up there. We just want to go through those in a bit more detail. So the owner's authorization we've talked a bit about this morning. We won't talk too much about that, but again, just to reiterate, if the land is owned by more than one person or company, written authorization must be obtained from each person or company named on the title. If the land is owned by a company or body corporate, written authorization must be obtained from company directors on company letterhead or under company seal for any body corporate. And then it's saying that all files must be submitted in PDF format. So in other words, when you're uploading on the Development One Stop Shop website, you can't upload a Word document, for instance. You need to convert that and save as to PDF, and then your files will be in the correct format for uploading and submitting as part of your application. So the second document, the Statement of Effect of Use or Development Proposal. Development applications made under Section 46 of the Planning Act. So this is the part of the Act that we're responding to when we make a statement of effect. Require the applicant to provide a statement describing the effect of the proposed use or development proposal. So that's really what you're doing in this document. You're describing the development. Nobody else knows what it's all about at this stage. You're the person who's doing the drafting and representing your client, so you need to explain to the Development Consent Authority what the proposal is all about. The statement should be detailed and should address, but not be limited to, those matters raised in Section 46 of the Planning Act. Applicants are advised that a consent authority to which the application has been made under Section 41 may reject an application without further consideration if it does not address the matters specified in 46.3. Okay? Brief summaries of these requirements are listed here for guidance. Note that development below is used in the wider context of its definition in terms of the Act. Okay? So this is a summary of Section 46 of the Act. Again, I'm not asking you to read the Planning Act or know all the sections in it, but this is the section that the Statement of Effect refers to, and we do need to have a look at this part a little bit in a bit more detail. So 46 Part 3A, and the matter to be addressed in the application, an assessment demonstrating how the proposed development will comply with any planning scheme that applies to the land. So in the Northern Territory, that's the NT planning scheme. Obviously, if you're in other jurisdictions, there may be other planning schemes that do apply, but the Northern Territory planning scheme covers everything in the Northern Territory. If you're working Queensland or in the other states and territories, I'm not very familiar with other planning schemes in other states and territories, but my understanding is that they can be quite different even within that state, in which part of different planning schemes apply to different jurisdictions. So if you are working elsewhere, just take some advice on that. So 46.3b, an assessment demonstrating how the proposed development will comply with an interim development control order, if any, applying to the land. So it's very important when you check your zoning that you check that if there's an interim development control order for that parcel of land. I gave the example earlier this morning of the Berry Springs area and the supply of water in that area. And so that area, until they can either source another water supply or, the water levels of their aquifer start to rise, there is an interim development control order there saying that nobody can put a new bore in the land there. And that's a problem. It's a problem for water supply in that area. So this is an interim development control order is very specific to a very small area, and it's also a temporary measure. It's not going to be in place for a long period. Okay, so that's 46.3b is saying that we need to have a look and see if there's any interim development control orders. In the applications we're doing, there are no interim development control orders. We're not going to go into that much detail, but it's just worth noting to yourself that these things exist and that they may apply. So 46.3c says if a public environmental report or environmental impact statement has been prepared or is required under the Environmental Assessment Act in relation to the proposed development, a copy of the report or statement and the results of any assessments of the report or statement under the Act by the Minister administering the Act. Gosh, I love all these legal terms. So it's just saying that if something exists, like, let me try find an example of this one. I have worked on an application in East Arm, which is a very industrial area, and it was for the processing of waste products from heavy industry, oil and gas, basically. And so they were looking to develop a site there for the storage of contaminated waste, liquid waste really, so oils and diesels and fuels all mixed in with the waste. And so that company, under the Environment Act, Assessment Act, had to prove to the environmental people that how they were going to deal with the waste. Now, so that report existed, and so it is under this part of the Planning Act, it says that if a report like that exists for another reason, you must submit it as part of your planning application as well. You can't just pretend to the planners that it doesn't exist, because the report could be very positive in saying that you're doing all the right things, but of course an environmental impact report could be very negative as well, okay? So the planners want to be aware of that if it exists, or if they request it. They can request an environmental assessment report as well. They can request lots of different reports from lots of different consultants, but the normal run-of-the-mill applications don't require you to have those supporting documents. D says an assessment demonstrating the merits of the proposal. So it's really under Part D that you're going to be looking at the planning scheme and assessing the merits of the development proposal. E, you want to describe the physical characteristics of the land, and a detailed assessment demonstrating the land's suitability for the purpose of the proposed development and effect of development on that land and other land. Now, this really starts applying if you're doing an application in a rural area on greenfield site that has never been developed for anything else. And you have to prove that that land is the land itself, the soil, and the especially if you're doing say sewage treatment waste on the soil, you'll need a full soil report to say that the appropriate seepage is available, because when you're dealing with waste sewage, not only do you have to deal with the actual solids and the real contaminated, you can do it in a septic tank or treatment system where you filter through all the solids and all the waste product. But at the end of that process, the other thing that you still have to deal with is just waste water. So you've purified this water and you've filtered out all the solids and all the impurities, but you still have water, and water in volume is considered a waste product. Do you understand what I mean? So if you've got a volume of water, so you have to then prove that the soil has the capability to soak up that water. Not so much of an issue in the Northern Territory. We have lots of evaporation here, and the soil, generally speaking, will soak away the water. But if you were near wetlands or floodplains or at risk of flood inundation, in the wet season, your soil is not going to soak away all that water. So what are you going to do with it? Or are you going to cause soggy, marshy soil to occur? And you definitely don't want that on your site. So this is asking for a statement to say what are the land's suitability for the purpose of the proposed development. Now, if we take that into the urban area and we think of somewhere like Zucoli, that kind of study has already been done when the land was subdivided. Okay, so they'll have done all the soil tests, and also those areas are fully serviced. So you're not going to be trying to have seepage in the soil to get rid of wastewater. You're just going to pump it all into the public sewage system. So it's not an issue in those areas. But you have to remember the planning scheme is worded and developed to cover all eventualities. Okay, so the applications we'll be looking at will be quite simple and won't require a lot of these things, but they are required in some instances. F, a statement specifying that the public facilities or open space available in the area on which the land is suited whether the land for public facilities or public open space is provided by the developer, and whether it is proposed that the facilities or open space be developed by the developer. So again, this is looking at public facilities and public open space areas. So if you're doing a large subdivision, for instance, are you putting in a park? Are you putting in an area maybe that would be useful for shops and services to the people in that area? But it's not applicable for just one site with one building. You're not expected to provide public open space on your site for that. So it depends where it's applicable to. G is a statement specifying that public utilities or infrastructure provided in the area in which the land is situated, requirement for public facilities and services to be connected to the land, and whether public utilities or infrastructure are provided by the developer or land is to be provided by the developer for the provision of public utilities or infrastructure. Again, probably relating more to big subdivision areas. So when you're responding to that for just a single lot in an area like Zuccoli, for instance, or even for the high-rise apartment, it's a fully serviced lot, and even in Coonawarra for the industrial warehouse on Coonawarra Road, the infrastructure, such as roads, when we talk infrastructure, we're talking about roads, water supply, electricity supply, telecommunications, and that sort of thing. So we can say that in response to that, we can just say that those services are provided as public services in those areas, okay? So we know that from the Dáil Before You Dig maps that there's a service connection point for each lot, and we can just simply say that the services are there and can be connected. But it does become a lot more complex when you're doing applications for land that's not serviced. H is an assessment of the potential impact on the existing and future amenity of the area in which the land is situated. So potential impact of a single dwelling in Zuccoli is very low because it's been identified and developed as a residential zone, and the planners fully expect that people are going to build single dwellings there, okay? Where this becomes a lot more complicated is I did an application, or was part of an application for do you know when you're coming out from Darwin City on the Stewart Highway and there's a new service station? It's where the pie shop was opened in there. It's where Bow Repairs used to be. Yeah, right on the corner. So, and actually 2 blocks up from that there was another application for another service station. So in that application we had to literally count traffic, look at the impact of cars turning into that site, cars turning out. Traffic assessments are one of the big impacts that new development can have in an area. You can imagine if you build a new shopping centre, you can imagine what Gateway did for the traffic flow in that area, and you saw all the different works that happened on the roadways around there. So for larger developments and more complex developments, this becomes very essential that you assess the impact on the existing and future amenity of the area. Okay, the impact of your development. What is it? How is it going to affect the area around it? And certainly increased traffic flow is a huge knock-on effect. But there can be others. There certainly can be others. Large industrial areas, you can imagine if you're doing a planning application for, let's just take the worst case scenario, a coal-fired, power station, you can imagine the pollution and the air quality in the area might be affected. So all of these things have to be taken into consideration at planning stage, and that's why the Act allows for all of this. And then an assessment of the beneficial or detriment to the public interest of the development. So, thinking about, we'll take the example of, a new corner shop that's about to sell alcohol. What is the effect of the public interest in that? Now, this is more thinking about the social side of it. If you have an amenity like that and it's selling alcohol, what sort of clientele is that going to attract? Are they going to hang around and try and drink on the street? Is there a nearby park that maybe, once was used by the local kids playing in the playground and now they're not going to anymore because they've got some itinerants hanging around drinking alcohol that they just bought at the local store that this planning application refers to, you know what I mean? So you have to take into account those sorts of scenarios. So, and that's what planning is all about. It's all about doing that assessment before the proposal is actually built. So you're not dealing with the effects afterwards, you're assessing them beforehand. And then the third one, the point 3 there, was the dimension plans. So dimension plans are required as part of this and any application, depending on the complexity of the development application. It depends what you might actually be asked to put forward. You have to consider some of the following information. So let's have a look. So site plan. Site plan is essential. So obviously a site plan identifies where the site is located, okay? It firmly identifies the boundary of the site. We've looked at this before in other units, you know, the boundary of the site. Why do you think the boundary is so important in terms of planning? Because normally planning requires you to have setbacks from the boundary, and they're all measured from the boundary. So how else are we going to determine if we've met the setback requirements? We have to have a very clear boundary outline of the site plan. Obviously, your north point, boundary dimensions, we certainly know how to draft all that up. Existing and proposed buildings and their distance from the lot boundaries. Okay, so that's what the information you need to have on that site plan. Okay, so it also applies to existing buildings. If there are existing buildings on the lot, then you need to draw them onto your site plan. All existing buildings, including the little shed down in the corner. On greenfield sites, brownfield sites that are just the boundary, you know, Zucoli, you go out there, we were all out there earlier in the year, you can very clearly see that the lots that haven't been developed are just vacant lots. There's nothing on them. It's just dirt, ground. Okay? But some lots, for instance, when you come to AT3 and you're preparing your planning application, there is an existing building on that site. And so you will have to very clearly define on your site plan what's an existing building, what's the proposed building. Because obviously the planners, when they receive the application, they don't know what's on the site. It's not up to them to find out either. It's up to you to clearly demonstrate on your site plan what's existing and what's proposed. And those are the two words we use, existing building, proposed building on the site plan. Very clearly labeling them. Okay? Any existing or proposed easements, substations and services. So existing and proposed easements. Vehicle access points. The proposed surfacing of parking areas, driveways, vehicle turning areas and loading areas. Okay, so on your site plan you need to show all on the site, all internal roads and parking areas. Of course, parking is a huge requirement of the Planning Act and scheme. And so we have to very clearly on our site plan demonstrate where the parking on site is. There's a lot of car parking calculations you have to do in terms of planning to work out how many car parks the Planning Act scheme requires you to have. And then you have to clearly identify them on your site plan. Landscape and open space areas, including types of planting, details of screening and or fencing, locations and descriptions. So, often when we go to prepare a planning application, you know, none of us here are landscapers or horticulturalists. So, but we certainly do need to provide as a set of documentation a landscaping plan. Okay, I tend to do it. Some people do it on the site plan. That's fine for a dwelling house, but on larger developments, you've got so much information on the site plan that I generally do the landscaping plan as a separate sheet. So you've got your site plan and a landscaping plan. And I think for the purposes of our application, we will just do that. Okay, even when you're doing the dwelling house, just do a separate sheet that is the landscaping plan. When we said the details, including types of planting, what level of detail do we need to go to? Well, we need to have, actually what they're looking for is the names of plant species, okay? But I'm not here to teach you the names of plant species. The Darwin City of Council, the City of Darwin have a planting list that they recommend, and on that list there's different native species that they recommend for planting in all around Darwin, and they have different heights of trees and all like that. So just on that landscaping plan, we just want you to start deciding where on the site you would put like one big tree, and where on the site you might put some shrubbery, and where on the site you might put some low plants. Okay, so but that information is certainly essential for planning. The proximity of adjoining buildings and their uses, okay? So again, their uses of existing buildings comes into play because the use of an existing building determines how many car parks the existing building will need and how many car parks the proposed building will need. And of course, you're going to have to add them together and provide that many car parks on site. The location of any bores on the subject property and adjoining land. Now again, this is more if the land is unserviced. So do we know what a bore is? No? A bore is when you drill a well, basically, to find drinking water. Okay? So for urban sites, not really applicable. Nobody drills bores in the city. But once you go out past Palmerston, it's very common to have bores on your sites out that way. Under a large portion of Australia, there's a aquifer, and so you don't have to drill, well, it's a decent amount you have to drill down, and you hit with the water table, and then you can pump that water up and use it as a water supply. Now, a lot of people, I don't know, how many people have ever drank bore water? You have bore water out in Mandorah, don't you?
Yeah, we've got a giant reservoir for uni.
Right.
Certain sites, but there's also a limitation because the bore has to be at least 100 meters away from surface land.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why
and that's exactly why they want to know this information on the site plan. If there are bores not only on your site, but if there are bores on the adjoining land, okay? Because something you could be proposing to do on this site could affect the drinking water that's being bored and pumped on the site beside you, and you have to be a certain distance away from those bores with any development. And certainly with any sewage treatment, because obviously we don't want the sewage treatment contaminating the bore water, because that's drinking water. So there's separation distances that apply between all those different functions of a site. Something, we won't be coming across it again in any of our applications, but certainly something to note if you're doing applications out in the rural area. The location of any proposed or existing effluent disposal systems on the sites, which is what I refer to as sewage. Okay? So again, treatment systems there. And the location of water meter arrangements and sewer access points from multiple dwellings, commercial and industrial developments. Will that apply to us? Yes, we have to show the connection points to our services, okay, on your site plan. So this is a really good list of what, when you're developing your site plan, as part of your set of documentation for this application, you need to refer to this list and you need to ensure that you've ticked off every single part of it, that information is on your site plan. Okay, so floor plans, so the site plan has to be a legible scale, not less than 1 in 500. So larger sites, you can have them at 1 to 500. Probably for our dwelling house, we'll be at 1 to 200. I would say all our site plans are 1 to 200. It's much easier to draw at a lower scale because you can get more information onto the one plan. If you go at 1 to 500, the plan becomes smaller, if you know what I mean. The actual area of the site on the page is smaller and it's more difficult to put a lot of detail on there. The lower the scale comes, the more detail you can get in. So the floor plan, what do we need in terms of the floor plan? We need dimensioned floor plans of existing and proposed buildings showing layout, partitioning, room sizes and uses. Okay? So let's break that down. What do we need to see on the floor plan? We need dimensions, but how much dimensions? Remember, the planner is not going to try and build the house off this set of plans. The planner just wants to see the information he needs to assess it against the planning scheme. So you're not going to put, so generally speaking for working drawings, we have 4 lines of dimensions working out. The planners generally need to see just the overall dimensions, distances to boundaries, distances to existing buildings, and they need room sizes. So you definitely need a schedule of room sizes on the floor plan. For planning, the overall area of the building is calculated to the outside of the external walls, okay? So when you're measuring the floor area of the entire building, it's the outside of the external walls. Room sizes internally, always. But when it shows the building layout, in other words, you need to see all the rooms. You can't just send a plan of the outline of the house and not show the rooms. The uses of the rooms are generally in residential applications. The room names must be very clearly on the floor plan, and the room name generally indicates the use, as in the kitchen or the bedroom. You know, we know what the use of those areas is going to be. Sometimes you can have rooms that have the use is a little bit, you know, we have this phenomenon in Australia called the rumpus room, which is basically a multi-purpose room that can be used for anything, but in terms of uses under planning, that's not an issue, so it's fine. So just room labelling, when we talk about the uses, doesn't mean you have to write a description for every room use, but you do need to label with the room names. A schedule stating the total area of each component use in the building, the total floor area and the percentage of site cover. Okay, so how would we work out the percentage of site cover for a house on a site? Site area. Site area is 100%, yeah.
And then you go, I don't know, does it include the area below or under the overhang as well, or just the wall?
That's a fantastic question, and it actually it's just the area inside the walls. However, there is a definition for that, and I'll actually get the planners. We'll ask that question of the planners tomorrow. So I want to start compiling a list of questions that we might have tomorrow, and I think that's really number one. You know, when we're calculating the areas, what about, because you know, in other jurisdictions, generally the outside walls of the house that is the envelope of the house. But in Darwin, we have these carports and verandas and balconies, and do we add all those in or not? And I think it's a really good question to get clarified. And so you need to have that schedule. So you've all been working on building schedules in Revit, and so certainly you will need a room area schedule, and that schedule must also total the floor area of the entire building. But that's why I want you to be careful on that, because I think in Revit, if you do all the room areas, and it'll give you the schedule and then it will total them, but in that total is not considering the external walls of the building, because it's just simply an addition of all the room areas, which isn't enough. You need a total area of the building to be to the outside of the external walls. Okay? So the next document in your set of drawings is your elevations and sections. Again, not a scale not less than 1:200. So you can't give them elevations at 1:500. It's not detailed enough. So you have to have all the elevations of the building, indicating finished floor levels, existing and finished ground levels, and external finishes. Okay. So existing and finished ground levels. So you could have a site where you're going to do quite a bit of extensive earthworks before you make the planning application. So all planning, so you know we have this idea that the house has to be a maximum in Darwin, it's 8.5 meters, okay? Building height limitations. And I've certainly seen it, say, for instance, in Bayview, where there's a bit of undulation of the land. So where do you take the ground level from? So it's literally, it's reasonably simple. If you've got a sloped site and you want to build a house on it, or a building on it, where is the 8.5 meters taken from? So it's an offset of this line, like this. Okay? So in all honesty, you could actually have you could have another room up there on another level as long as it stays below the 8.5. Okay? But this is the original ground level. Okay? If you come along and you decide that you're going to fill this area with land, you're going to build it up, and you're going to begin building your house from the new level. Oh, this razor's terrible. Now, your line still remains the same. So you can only have a maximum height to here, and perhaps go up again, and you have to terrace the house or something like that. Because that is not the ground line, that is the ground line, the original one. Okay? So doesn't suit to really bring a lot of fill in on site. So that's a bit of an exaggeration, but if you bring fill in, remember that fill, that build up that you're doing is part of the 8.5 meters to the overall height. You have to find out. You have to find out. So I actually had a planning application exactly like this. It was really quite interesting. So the site, you can go do a drive-by tomorrow maybe and have a look at it. There was an original ground level that kind of was like that. And they had dug out down here and built a 2-story house like this. Quite cool. There was actually a little bridge that came across here into the front main entrance of the house. I should wipe out this other one so you can see a bit clearer. And this guy wanted to build another building on the site. And the planners, when we lodged the application, they were taking it that this was the natural ground level here. And they were applying that across here. So the extension that he was building, it was actually another like a granny flat in the background. They were saying that this was too high. It was actually coming up higher than that. And that they were taking the 8.5. We were able to go back and have an engineer prove that the original ground line was actually way down here. Yeah. We got the application through on that. Well, was the original ground line did do something like this? Sorry, did I just say that backwards? The original ground line used to go through here, and then the 8.5 was higher again, and so we could, by proving that this was the original ground line, we could go higher. Yeah, sorry, I said that backwards the first time, didn't I? Yeah, the original ground line was here.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So it's interesting, and it is about the original ground line. And sometimes that is on older sites that have been, developed and, remodeled. I'll bring you past that tomorrow after we're coming back from the kind of thing, and I'll show you where it is. It's right on the top of the hill, where the old hospital site is in the city. Yeah, it's right there. So they had cut down, because it's quite a steep hill there. And so instead of building on the slope, they'd cut away the natural ground and built down below the level of the road. Yes, so indicating finished floor levels, because of course they want to use these. So when I'm lodging an application, I very clearly on the application show overall building height. On your section or elevation, you need to and don't put 2-dimensional lines on 2 different plans showing 2 different overall building heights. Make sure it's very consistent across your elevations and sections, and very clearly show the overall building height. And the natural ground level. And sufficient cross sections and longitudinal sections to show the relationship between structures and their respective heights. So same type of information. So when you're thinking about that documentation set, just be very clear. You're only putting the information on the sections and elevations that you need to prove compliance with the planning scheme. You're not developing a set of working drawings. You're not trying to show the builder how to build. You don't need a section that starts telling me about, block work or, how to build it or what mortar joints you need to have. The planner doesn't need to know that sort of detailed information that you would need to actually build the building. They only need to know enough information to prove compliance with the planning scheme. Okay, is that clear? We'll be certainly, when we get to building permit application, that's when we start to need to put very detailed information on our set of drawings. But planning applications often occur quite early in the process. So, you've worked with the client and you've come up with a design and you're at concept design stage. The next point is to say, right, do we or don't we need a planning application? And often you do. Remembering the only time that you're exempt from a full development application is if it's a residential dwelling, single dwelling on a lot and is fully compliant. Okay, single dwellings do require applications if they're not fully compliant. Do you understand what I mean? So if you have a house on a site and it's encroaching on a setback, or it's too high, or, you know, I think those are generally the only reasons that we need to make applications, then you do need to make a full application. If you're fully compliant, if your house complies with all the setbacks, then you don't need to make an application. It's just a compliance check. That's the only exemption. All other applications, all MDs, multiple dwellings, duplexes, high-rise residential, all commercial buildings need a full application every time. No exemptions. Okay, we don't really need to go in the proposals to subdivide or consolidate, but obviously they have their own set of requirements there. Clearing of natural vegetation proposal is also got its own requirements, but those are basically what you need. So in terms of a set of documents, let's do a checklist for that now as well, because you do need to submit all these checklists, and let's have a look at what we need. I can't clean this. All right, so what's the first document in the set we need? Site plan. And what are the essentials of the site plan? What? Boundaries? Boundaries?
Easement.
What's that?
Easement.
Easements? Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to put that setbacks to the boundaries. Anything else? What kind of buildings? Existing and proposed buildings. I'm just going to say connection points, all right? Second drawing. Second sheet. What do we need and what information needs to be on it? Go for it. Floor plans. And what do we need on the floor plan? What? A tree? Yeah. Unless you could build in a tree house, maybe.
Building layout.
What's that?
Building layout.
The layout, yeah. So the floor plan itself, the building layout. What else? And we would have that on the site plan. That wouldn't be on your floor plan. What about the uses?
Total area.
How are we going to tell the planner what the use of the building is?
Dimension.
Sorry?
Dimension.
Dimension.
Overall dimensions, that's
Well, we need overall dimensions, but we'll think about the uses first. How are we going to tell the planner what the building is used for? Room labels, room names. Yeah.
sizes.
Names and sizes and dimensions. So the dimensions are overall and rooms. Boundaries? Which one are you to point?
Easement.
Easements. Easements are when you have, you find them when you look on NR maps, and it'll show you where an easement is. So an easement is generally an area of land which could be on your site that there are public services going through. No, not a locality plan. When we come across one, tell me and I'll come and show it to you. But it's an area on the land. If you've got a site, so this is your site, and let's say, for instance, this is a road up here, and there's a road down here, and we've got another site like that. Sometimes you can get like the sewage pipe runs through here. On the older sites, that often happens. So that area, even though it's within the site, so this is the site we're looking at, it's within that site and you own it as part of your site, it's still got an easement on it, which kind of means like a right of way for services. So you can't build on an easement. You can't put a garden shed on the easement because Power Water or one of the utility providers can at any point have to come in and dig up to get to their pipe in that easement. So easements are shown in our maps. When you look up the site details, it will show you if there's an easement on the site. So if there's an easement anywhere on the site, it must be very clearly marked on your site plan. Okay, and I do know we definitely do have an easement on 83. Okay.
I wonder about doorways and openings in terms of windows, because I've read like sometimes, you can be like 1 meter from, like the wall can be 1 meter from the boundary if there's no windows. But if you have windows, it has to be minimum 1.5 meters, for example. So I would assume that the openings do play a role.
Not in planning, in building certification, that all comes into it. So the window openings, was it?
I'm pretty sure I read it in the planning scheme.
You'll have to show it to me. It generally is to do with fire, if there's a window opening, which is more to do with the NCC compliance for fire regulations.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I read it.
Because generally planning is just wants to know about the building setback. It's not to do with fire. So you do need to show on your elevations where the openings are in the building. And I have to say, like back in Ireland, and I know in other jurisdictions in Australia, if you moved a window, for instance, during the working stage of your project or the construction stage, you would have to reapply for planning because you've moved a window. But in the NT planning scheme, you don't have to do that because you're not non-compliant. Even doesn't matter where the window is, as long as you still have the correct setback in that whole wall or facade. But if you can find that, let me have a look at it, and I'll certainly answer your question.
Yeah.
We can ask that tomorrow.
Yeah, because we had a look at a house.
Yeah.
That it was like, it had like a little area between that, like, where there's like, constraints to build an ensuite, and I just had a look how close to the boundary can you go. And I'm pretty sure I looked up NC planning scheme, not NCC for it, and it did say that it's 1 meter if you don't have any windows, and 1.5 if you have got the minimum setback.
So there is and we'll look at it later today. We will be reading this later today. So with setbacks, it generally says, you have a 1.5 setback. Say, for instance, on a primary boundary for most residential sites in the northern suburbs, you could have to build your house 6 meters back from the primary road, so the offset of the boundary back 6 meters. However, if you have a veranda or a porch, something like that in the front of your house, that setback then reduces to 4.5. But it doesn't specifically talk about windows. It talks about verandas and carports and the like.
If side and rear boundaries for 1 and 2 story buildings, or 1 meter provided that the subject to wall only includes openings that are either glazed in a flat material and cannot be opened or have a fill height, doesn't extend beyond maximum height of 3.5 meters. So
Yes, okay. Yeah, and that is for bathrooms, so that's what it's saying. You can have a small bathroom with a small window, sorry, yes, you can. No windows at all, yeah. And that's to do with overlooking of your neighbours, so you're not directly looking into their, but it's not to do with the fire. The fire generally supersedes that one because you don't really want to have to do that because then you have to fireproof all those walls as well. Yeah.
What about when you...
Sorry, I forgot about that clause.
What about when you build on the...
0, yeah.
I don't know, like that's the last one.
there will be fireproofing for sure then.
Mm.
You'll have like a firewall.
Yeah, it'll have to be. Have to be.
So what are the reasons you are allowed to build on the 0 lot line?
Oh, so that's so you can utilize your site a bit better. Right, so...
Like, can anyone do it? Like, if I was building and you were saying, I want to build on 0 lot line, I could go, oh yeah, I want to build on...
You need to get a planning approval.
You need to get planning approval.
and
Yeah, you can.
drawings, and so you could do it.
You can apply. I'm not saying they'll give you permission to do it, but you can certainly apply, yeah. Yes, yeah. I've done endless applications for reduced setbacks and 0 lot line, and they've mostly been successful. But they do kind of depend on your neighbour not objecting to that. So I always advise my clients, if they know their neighbours, if they get on okay with their neighbours, to the best thing you can do when you're dealing with the public like that and dealing with neighbours is give them forewarning. Don't just lodge the application and let them have a pink sign come up and then they go, oh, this is what the neighbours are doing, because that is just the worst outcome for everyone. So really go and approach them, go and talk to them about the proposed design before anything's on paper at all, and just say, ask them what they would think about that, ask them, are there any considerations that they have that they would like to put forward before you start designing at all. Sometimes that can be just how the roof is pitched, how it's going to look from their side, I always say, offer a sweetener, offer to paint the wall whatever colour they want, or, to offer to buy them some trees so they can screen the wall if it's going to be a big, expansive blank wall in their yard. Offer to do some work on their site as well, within reason. But that is if you really want something like that, it's a really good way of negotiating to get what you want without objection. Once an official objection goes in, everyone's involved in that. Whereas if it's just you and your client and their neighbour, and you can come to some sort of design solution before all of that, much better outcomes.
Yep.
Yeah, but it can be done. Certainly can be done. And so Zuccoli, remember we looked at the 0 lot lines there, so they have special consideration, and we look at that in the planning scheme for Zuccoli to have 0 lot lines. Yeah. I absolutely can't get why we put 1.5 meters between houses and we just don't build semi-detached houses. Like, it would make so much more sense to have just one wall that was part of both houses, instead of having one house that's a 0 lot line and then 1.5 meters. Like, even if you've got a window in that 1.5 meter wall, what are you going to look at? You're going to look at a wall of the next door neighbour's house. So far better off that we would just build 2 houses with 0 lot lines side by side and have one wall that's common to both houses. And so the structure then becomes, you need to build them together at the same time. So this is the objection. People want my lot to do what I want on it, and I don't want to have to work in design with the other one. So it's really common in other jurisdictions to build duplexes or semi-detached houses where you just have a common party wall. And so one house is the mirror of the other one. And what that does is it gives you a lot of space around the other side of the house because you've pulled the houses very tight together. You've got the garden space on 3 sides of the house. It works. What I think they haven't even realised in Darwin yet is every time I did an energy assessment on a duplex, the star rating went through the roof. And this is because when you've got a single dwelling and you've got sun on all four sides of it and the roof, it's much more what we call building envelope, much more area to bring heat in. When you build a duplex, you've only got then the three sides plus the roof. So you have one whole wall that's continuously, shall we say, shaded. It's complete. It's an internal wall.
Forward, you know, because
Yeah.
people are air conditioning.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yep. So it's a really much better way of doing it, and I think we'll see a lot more of it in the future. But at the moment, we're all clinging on dearly to the fact that we all want our own lot and our own house with our own four walls. Yeah, we don't want to share walls with anyone. It's you know, moving on in the future. Sorry? We have a lot of apartments, yeah. A lot of the apartments come from having a transient population, though. People who don't want to own a house here, they just want to come and live here for a couple of years and move on again. I think that's where a lot of the apartments come from. But I've done a lot of energy ratings on apartments too, and they rate very, very well. Like, much more energy efficient to live in an apartment or a duplex than in a single dwelling here. Yeah, shared external walls. Yeah, and the shade that you get from being joined to other units and dwellings. Yep. Anyway, where was I? Floor plans. Yeah, so I think that's about all we have to have on the floor plans. Number 3. Elevations and sections. We'll just group them together. And so what's the most important piece of information on the elevations and sections?
Building height.
Level.
Yeah. Sections. And so we really want the overall height. What else?
Finished floor level. Natural ground level.
And natural ground level. And number 4.
It mentions the finishes on the floors.
No, that's the height, the floor finished heights.
Is
It's
it?
not the floor
Okay.
finishes. You don't need to know internal finishes for planning. No. The other one I'm going to put on the elevations, they don't need to have it in Darwin, but every other jurisdiction I've ever worked in needs to have this, and I think it's a really good practice to start putting it on your elevations, is your finishes, external finishes. So by external finishes, I mean, tell them that your blockwork house is rendered, okay? Tell them what colour you're going to paint it. If it's metal cladding, tell them what colour the metal cladding is going to be. Okay, it's just colours and finishes. Again, not to the detail you would need if you wanted to build it. So you don't have to tell me how thick the render is. I don't need to know if your cladding is compliant with a deemed to comply number. I don't need those sorts of notes. I just need to know it's colour bond custom morb cladding and the colour is, you know, headland. Yeah. So just enough so that they can visualize what the building is going to look like.
Just to clarify, is there something about landscaping plan
Yes,
that we need?
that's number 4. Thank you very much. I think you happened on it quite by mistake. So we said we put them separately. And on your landscaping plans, what do we need to see?
Wonder there's driveway and stuff like that.
Site plan. Yeah, I should have it up here. And parking. We forgot that one. So landscaping plans, what do I need to see on there?
Vegetation.
So it's usually proposed planting.
Existing trees.
I'll say existing vegetation to be retained. Although the norm in Darwin is to clear the whole site and then build the building and then plant. But, you know, sometimes if we want to be a little bit more conservative, we could retain some of the existing Usually it's just existing trees. We don't normally keep existing plants, so existing vegetation we'll say. What else? We've one more on the landscaping plan. Quite important. Now that's the ground line. That's on your, it's on your sections usually in your elevations. Landscaping plan is usually just a plan, and you don't normally do sections of landscaping. That's on your site plan. Oh, you definitely have that on your landscaping plan too, where the building is. Yeah. Fences, guys, fences. Really important. Fencing. All right, so build up your checklist.
What checklist is this for?
We need to develop 3 set checklists, and then you're going to use them when you're putting your application together. But the
planning application
yeah,
checklist.
this is your documentation checklist.
Documentation, it's not for.
Yeah, I was trying to find which one.
No, it's documentation checklist. So this is just so you know. So you understand. In the first checklist, we had 4 items, and one of those items was called dimension plans. Yeah, dimension documentation. This is the list of that documentation, right? So we're coming down a step now. And we're looking at the documentation. So when we say documentation on that first list, this is what we mean. Okay. But one of the one of the requirements of this unit is that we submit the checklist as well. So we have to develop up these checklists. It's absolutely to assist you in developing an application, a full application, and not to be missing parts of the application. But it's also part of the assessment that we do this work and we develop up the checklist, give you an understanding of what a complete application looks like. Okay, I'm happy with those checklists. I'm just going to go back a step now before I go forwards again. I gave you another handout there just before lunchtime, which looks at some of the committees. Board committees and authorities. Yeah, I thought I had one here, but I don't seem to have it. So some of these committees, again, I just want to briefly touch on this. Again, it's not really to do with what you need to do, but there are a couple of committees called statutory committees under the NT Planning Act. By statutory, it means that they have some level of legality or power, that they're committees that generally the members are on there in a voluntary capacity, or they're selected by the minister to be on there to give the minister advice. But they certainly have a level of power. They're just not your normal sporting club committee or something like that. They're part of the legislation in the Northern Territory. One of them is on the back there is the Northern Territory Planning Commission. It's an independent statutory authority. It sets the strategic framework for the integral land use, transport and infrastructure planning, work to deliver more sustainable and cost-effective outcomes for community. So again, this committee would provide advice to the statutory planners when they're developing up their area plans. The Development Consent Authority it's not a committee, but it's a department under the Planning Act. We looked at that earlier. So they also have 7 division areas. there, Alice Springs, Bachelor, Darwin, Catherine, Litchfield, Palmerston, Tennant Creek, where we make our applications to. So on the sign you can see that there's Darwin, Alice Springs, Catherine, so I think Catherine maybe looks after Tennant Creek. Perhaps, I don't think they've got their own ones, but there are 7 jurisdictions for the larger population areas in the NT. Building Advisory Committee, I'm actually on the Building Advisory Committee, so we advise the Minister on anything to do with, it's more to do with the NCC side of things, so building legislation and regulation in the Northern Territory. And also changes to that regulation if we feel, it's usually people from industry who feel that some changes are actually required, so you advise the Minister on that. And the Building Appeals Board, again, is more to do with certification, but really the ones to do with planning are the Northern Territory Planning Commission. The Valuation Board, the very last one there, is just generally about the value of land. So remember I was telling you on the NT Islands you can download a very detailed document about any parcel of land and it will give you who owns the land and all that information. It also gives a value to each parcel of land in the Northern Territory, and the Valuation Board look after that. Sorry? Yeah, just the land on its own, not the house, just the land itself. So land values go up and down depending on demand and markets. I'm sure your other half could tell us probably more about that. You might want to ask him. Okay, so I just generally wanted to go through those boards and committees. I just need to check my list to make sure I'm not missing anything. Flying. Yeah, so I'm just going to take a break from that for a second. So the next step really is to have a look at the planning scheme itself. And we're going to go straight to part 3. So we briefly looked at the different parts. So the first part is the user guide to the Northern Territory Planning Scheme, which I'd quite like you guys to have a look through tomorrow in the afternoon or in the evening time, whatever suits. Part 2 really talks about the different areas. And then part 3 is our index of zones. So we'll have a look through the different zones. Even just from the index here, we can see an explanation for these letters. So we generally just see the letters on any zoning map that we look at. So we've got Zone SD, Single Dwelling Residential, Zone MD, Multiple Dwelling Residential, and Zone MR, Medium Density Residential. Now I have to say, just be warned not to get those two mixed up. It's quite easy to do. The MD is the Multiple Dwelling Residential and the MR, Medium Density Residential. Okay, MD and MR. And the HR then is the High Density Residential. So those are our main residential zonings. After that, we've got CV. Can you see this? Do you want me to zoom in that a little bit? So CV is Caravan Park, CL Community Living. So community living refers to things like hostels, like more like permanent living hostels, like maybe St. Vincent de Paul type supported accommodation, or residential aged care can be under that as well. CB, Central Business. So that refers to, as we spoke about earlier, the Central Business Districts. C on its own is Commercial. SC, Service Commercial. TC, Tourist Commercial. LI, Light Industry, we spoke a bit about earlier. And then they've got GI, General Industry, which is more like the heavier industries. DV is for development, very general. PS, public open space, so that's your parks and or plazas. We don't tend to have a lot of plazas up here. Or organised recreational, so, you know, sporting fields and that type of thing. H is horticulture, A for agriculture. RR, rural residential. And then you've got RL, rural living, and R on its own, just rural. So those are your three main zonings for the rural area. CP, community purposes. We saw earlier on the map that somewhere such as CDU is zoned as community purposes. CN is conservation, HT is heritage sites, RD, restricted development, WM, water management, FD, future development, and T is for the township. So this is the main list of zones. We're going to look at the definitions for them now in a minute. And then part 4 gets into the actual clauses. So can you see we begin with 6.0, 6.1, 6.2. You will become quite familiar with these clause numbers, okay? So up front in the planning scheme, in the index here, is where we can find a quick reference to the different clause numbers. They generally start with 6. Moving in, some of them move on to the 7s and into the 8s. And then part 5, so all of those clauses from the 6s through to the 10s are all fairly general clauses, and we'll go through where we're referred to. So obviously you don't have to read every clause in the planning scheme for every application, and I'll show you where the table is to find out which clauses apply to your particular use in your particular zone. But and then part 5 generally refers to the subdivision of land. We won't be doing a subdivision application, but if you ever do need to find it, it's in there under part 5. Part 6 looks at the Aboriginal communities and towns. Many offices in Darwin look at doing developments out in Aboriginal communities, so if you need to do anything out there, you maybe need to refer to part 6. 7 is more to do with your transport, and part 8 then is just your area plans. So as you can see, we've got some general area plans, Darwin, and then you've got some very specialised areas that have conditions that are maybe a little bit more precise than the general planning scheme. So we can see the Darwin City waterfront is one of those areas, Berrimah North, Francis Bay, Berrimah Farm. And then we've got all the other area plans, Bachelor, Borroloola, and down around Alice Springs, Palmerston. The special one there for Palmerston City Centre planning principles and area plans. So if you're doing developments in any of these particular areas, it's good to always reference this part and make sure that there isn't a particular area plan, because the area plan will supersede anything in the general planning scheme. The area plan is much more precise for the actual location. So you do need to know and be aware of areas, and this gets updated all the time, different area plans. I think the Howard Springs one is quite a new area plan. Got some schedules relating to specific uses in some areas. For instance, Crabclaw Island there, I'm sure the specific use out there is for tourism. It's just a resort out at Crabclaw Island. Lake Bennett, again, tourist resort. Maracay would be something similar. So there's specific uses to those areas, because most likely the land in those areas was just zoned as either maybe agricultural land, and again, as if you want to develop a tourist industry out there, we do want to see development of the Northern Territory in terms of tourism, and so they've developed a special area plan to allow for that in those remote areas that otherwise wouldn't have a plan. It would be just land. And that's the scheme in general. So, I have to find, I have no bookmarks on this now. Damn, hold on, I need to open this in Bluebeam. I find it much easier to navigate these documents in Bluebeam. Maybe I'm just more used to it. So when we get into part 3, again, it's got the list of zones there that we've just looked at before. It's just a table with exactly what we went through on the index. And then it brings us into each zone and it gives us the purpose of each zone. So SD, single dwelling, is one we come across a lot. And so the primary purpose of SD is to provide single dwellings on individual lots. Non-residential uses or developments should be limited to those which predominantly service the local neighbourhood and do not have any detrimental effect on residential amenity. Okay? So no noise pollution in residential areas is a big one. So there are some. So then we go on to the zoning table for SD, and these are really important, these zoning tables, okay? But before we actually look at that, I want to look at the uses. So has anyone found, or in the document, where so all of these uses have a definition? Abattoir, helicopter. I just want to quickly look at the definitions. I didn't see that in the earlier thing. Definitions, where is it? Here we go, 1.9. Okay, so at 1.9, you can follow that, we've got the definitions, and this goes through the definitions for each use in the planning scheme. Tomorrow afternoon, I want you to read through each of these uses and just get a brief overview of what each definition means, okay? So abattoir means premises used for the slaughter and dressing of animals. Includes the processing of meat from such slaughter. This is the very first one up. So agriculture, what does it actually mean? And it's really important when you define a use for a building that you refer back to these definitions and read what that use actually means. When we think about residential and single residential, it doesn't get that complex, but when you get into commercial buildings, this becomes a lot more complex. So basement, what does that mean? It means a story below, either below ground level or that project no more than 1 meter above ground level. Okay, so definitions for all of these things. Building setback, here's one we should probably know, means the distance from any lot boundary to a building shall be measured from all boundaries to a wall of a building, the outer surface of the railings of a balcony or veranda, the outer surface of any support column of a ground level veranda, the outer surface of any supporting column for structures without external walls, except that the setback of a shade sail is measured to the outer extremity of the fabric. Okay? So important definitions to know, because where you draw your dimension line that denotes the setback, you need to know where they are on the building exactly. Any questions on that? A store? Yeah. Yeah, shed?
Yeah, shed.
Yeah.
Important to, it has a sort of...
Yes, it does. All structures have setbacks for planning, yeah.
So
Yeah.
If the building has to 3 meters from boundary.
We'll look now at what, so it depends on, so for planning, and I think this is probably the most important piece of information I can give you guys. When you start looking at the planning scheme, there are 2 things you need to know. One is the use of your building, and the other is the zone. Once you know those 2 things, we can use the zoning tables to know which parts of the planning scheme apply. Because when you start off with those 2 pieces of information, it will send you to a different part of the planning scheme, okay? And what you read then will be different for every zone and every use. So when people say to me, oh, what's the setback for a single dwelling, you know? Well, it depends what zone it's in. Okay, so if it's a single dwelling in zone residential, it will have a particular setback. But I try not to remember setback distances, and I try not to quote the planning scheme, because I think a really good piece of advice I can give you is every single application, look it up. If you start making assumptions and going, oh, that setback was for that project I did last week, oh, it's the same for this one, if you do that, you're going to fall into a trap. You're going to, somewhere along the way, there's going to be an interim development control order on that piece of land. It's going to have a different zoning. or maybe the use of the building for commercial is slightly different, and that means that the setback is slightly different. So every application, look it up. That's the best piece of advice I can give you. Know your zone and know your use and look it up, okay? So these are the uses and definitions of all the things in there. So in the event of a site having frontage to more than one street, and this is actually really important and this often happens, so you often get a corner block and you've got a street on either side. Which of those is your primary street? So there's a different setback distance for the primary street and a different setback distance from side streets. So it's measured from the, say that again, in the event of a site having frontage to more than one street, the building setback through the corner truncation is measured from the intersecting point of the primary street setback and the secondary street setback. Wow, I'm not really sure what that means. Let's just figure that one out. Car park means the parking of motor vehicles, otherwise as an ancillary use of the land. So that's just your normal car park on another site that is for another use. But then you can also have a car parking area, which is like, you know, the whole site may be a car park. That's an actual use. It is a car park. Okay, so tomorrow, can you please read through all of the definitions and just, I'm not asking you to memorize them all, you never will, but just get an understanding of them. And if there are ones that you don't understand, please highlight them. Dwelling means a building or part of a building designed, constructed, or adapted as a self-contained residence. Okay, self-contained is important there. Light industry means an industry which, in the process carried on, the machinery used, and the goods and commodities carried to and from the premises on which the industry is sited are not of such a kind that are likely to adversely affect the amenity of the surrounding locality by reason of emission of noise, vibrations, smells, fumes, smoke, vapor, steam, soot, ash, dust, wastewater, waste products, grit, oil, or otherwise. Okay? So there's your definition of light industry versus your heavier industry. So heavier industries, general industry can do all of this, but light industry is not allowed to do that. And there are different zones. So office means a building or part of a building used for the conduct of administration, whether public or otherwise, the practice of profession or the carrying on of mercantile, banking, insurance, legal, clerical, or other similar service, but does not include home occupation. What's home occupation? There is another definition for it. Further up under H, maybe. So home occupation is basically a home office. So it means an occupation or profession which is carried on in a dwelling or on the site of a dwelling by a person resident in the dwelling, and may include the caring for up to 5 children, including children who reside in the dwelling. Often, the most common home occupation I know is a doctor's surgery. So if the doctor lives at the house and he has a surgery at the house where patients can come in, and you know, there's one actually in the Cara right on my street. Yeah, so that's a home occupation. You're allowed to do that. So there's not a whole lot of businesses you are allowed to set up in a residential area, but a home occupation is one of them. So obviously it refers directly to childcare there. But you can have a home office. So you could set up your drafting office in your house in your front living room and have your clients coming in and out and visit you. But you do need to apply for planning for that. It's permitted, but you do need to apply for planning. You can't just do it. Why can't you just do it? A lot of people, and this is where clients will come to you and say, well, I've been running my office for the last 6 years, you know, that's why you'll get, and why you actually needed planning for that. But why can't you do it? Because it increases traffic in the area. You need to have some means of car parking. Nobody wants, if everyone in the same street set up a home office in their front room, Can you imagine the car parking congestion on a street if 3 or 4 cars at any one time needed to visit all of the offices? And this is a huge concern, you know, that we have enough, well, we don't block up our streets and we don't, you know, cause the other residents in that area distress because they can't park their car. Yeah? And that's why all these things are here. They're for the good of, planning is for the good of the community as a whole. It's not just for particular projects, it's to look at how each project will affect the community as a whole. Okay, so have a look through them tomorrow. Let's get on to something a bit more teeth in it. And we'll go back down to part 3. And our index of zones. So, oh damn. Hold on, before I go back up there, I need to go back. What was that one on again? 1.9, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So we have to identify our use for a single dwelling. Okay? So what's our use going to be? We have to pick one. Dwelling isn't a use, though.
Residential.
Residential is what I'm looking for. Industrial. Go to our table first for single dwelling. And so on each of these tables, there are permitted, self-assessable, and discretionary and prohibited uses. Okay? So there's 4 words there. And P, permitted, is you're allowed to do that use on that particular zone. And self-assessable, it means that you can just assess it yourself, basically. And have a compliance check done on it. They're not really very common at all. Discretionary means you must apply for an application or a permit for that site, and it's at the discretion of the DCA and the committee whether or not they grant it to you. Prohibited, the X, basically means don't bother applying. Okay, so it's a good little table to bring into your client meeting when you're telling him that, you know, he or she is never going to be able to put a transport terminal on a site in the car, you know. It's just not going to work. So in a zone, in zone single dwelling, SC, what is permitted? So we can have a business sign. So outside your house, you've got business going on there, you're allowed to have a business sign. You can have a community centre, but it's a discretionary use, okay? So if a community wants to purchase a house and turn it into a community centre, that will be a discretionary use, and they have to apply for planning for that. Group home is also permitted use.
What's that?
Group home is generally often is like for people maybe with disabilities who maybe can have some level of independent living, and maybe they live with a carer or something like that. Maybe 2 or 3 people live with one carer. Can happen for elderly as well. Yeah. So there is a definition of group home under the definition. You can have a look there. Home-based childcare is discretionary. Home-based contracting. I'm not quite sure what the definition is for that, but I have to look it up. But it's a permitted use. And home-based visitor accommodation. And home occupation is permitted as well. An independent unit is permitted. So what do we know what an independent unit is? Again, please look all of these up in the definitions tomorrow, part of your work. Independent unit usually refers to like a granny flat that's detached from the building. Okay, it's got limitations on the maximum size it can be. So it is like a second dwelling on a site. But the word independent will tell you it's away from the house. It's not really a granny flat built underneath an elevated house. It's a separate unit. You see a lot of people buy like maybe it's a mounted or something like that. It's a little prettier than that, and put it on the back for maybe some sort of relative support that they want to go with. It usually has to be a relative living with. Medical consulting rooms are discretionary. And then further down here, we found our use is single dwelling. So our use is single dwelling. This is a little bit confusing because it usually doesn't happen like this, that your use and your zone have the same name. So we've got a use that's single dwelling and a zone that's single dwelling. So do you see the clause numbers here then that's referenced after that? So a couple of pieces of information. We've got a use that is permitted, it's P, it's permitted, and we've got a some clause numbers. So your third and final checklist for the day will be a checklist for a single dwelling in zone SC, single dwelling as well. And down the side of your list will be these clause numbers. We're going to have a look at those clauses now. This is the third checklist. There's three checklists, two that we already did, and then a third. You can put them up later if you put them all into one document. This checklist will certainly change for assessment tasks 2 and 3. The list of clauses will look quite different. Now, of course, we know with the dwelling that if you are fully compliant, you don't need to make an application. However, we won't be fully compliant on this one. Please make sure on the top of your checklist you space to write the zone and the use. have a look then, we want to go to 6.5.1. And we're going to go down to part 4. Can you see that for each zone, as we skip through this, each zone has a different table with different types of uses and different types of discretionary permitted uses, and then different lists of solved numbers. Okay, so that's how the scheme applies to every building type in every zone. Okay, is that clear to everyone how you use the table? And then we go to part 4. Okay, so this is an interactive. You actually you have to find the goal. We're looking for 6.5.1.